Welcome to our Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Helga Janssen-Daubia. In July 2021, South Africa was rocked by economic sabotage, food riots, looting, and mass destruction of business and state infrastructure. Nearly 300 people were killed as the country was shocked by the tsunami of violence, and security forces struggled to contain the situation. What started off as protests and sabotage action against the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma soon morphed into a mass revolt as poor people and opportunists took to the streets and malls to secure food and whatever they could lay their hands on. In today's show, we assess and analyse the events of July 2021 and hear from our guests what they think should be done to address South Africa's socio-political and economic challenges. With us via Zoom to discuss this, we're joined by Mercia Andrews, Executive Director of the Trust for Community Outreach and Education. Welcome, Mercia.
Good to be on the show.
We're also joined by SAFTU's Education Officer, Ferran Pedro. Hi, Ferran. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Sabu Zikoda, President of Abashlali Bas Njondolo. Welcome and thank you for the time. We know you're extremely busy.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on the show.
We will be joined later in the show by the Unemployed People's Movement. For now, we'll continue with the show. Butsubu, let's start off with you. Last week, July 2021, was indeed an extremely traumatic week for the entire country. Take us through what happened.
Yes, I must say that I have to say this with a very heavy heart, what we've seen and what we've witnessed starting on Monday, the 12th of July, where those of us who are living in sheds and in townships, we were confronted with a situation that we've never seen before, when basically a number of people who seems to have been organized prior these food riots, they were in their numbers flooding into the nearby shops, targeting mainly big stores like your Spars, your ShopRites, warehouses, and other factories. Basically, people were flooding into those active economic areas, to actually take food for themselves. So food was taken, a lot of stuff that the business people own, but I think the main focus that we've seen was really people taking food, people who seemed to be hungry for a very long time. It began with mostly young people that we've noticed that there were more young people who were energetic, but who were hungry, but angry at the same time. You would not have stopped them. So that is how this kind of situation began. And people were just helping themselves with food in a number of areas in Durban, in Johannesburg, not only in those active economic areas, but also in townships. We have seen these even in the malls. So this kind of situation left us very confused as to how this was planned, because it seemed to have been well coordinated and well planned.
Butsubu, can I thank you for that? I just want us to pause on the almost the way in which it was planned. The one point that you did raise, that it was a conflation of anger and hunger. Ferran, give us some kind of analysis, because this was not only unemployed people, this was also people who are underemployed. Give us your analysis of how some of these elements, these different facets of poor people suddenly came together and looted.
Thank you. The research shows us, and our past experiences of events like this show us that phenomenon like what we've seen in the last week are really caused by one thing. So Comrade Sabu has alluded to perhaps some hidden hands or various factors in terms of who was coordinating or instigating the unrest. And it's clear that it was instigated by supporters of the Zuma campaign, but that this then led to a wave of ordinary people, working class people joining in. And that often happens where group dynamics, active looting, or riots lead to a snowball, and more people will join in. But in particular in South Africa, this is not um, a case that we would say is not inevitable. You know, and for as long as we've been writing about, even before the pandemic, SAFTU has said that we are the country finds itself at a precipice, right? That our country is in economic and social crisis, and the theory that that we're sitting on a powder keg, that at any moment social unrest, right, and like this could erupt, is absolutely clear because of the levels of poverty, unemployment, in particular amongst the youth and women. We saw many young people participating in the unrest in the last week, and many of them also losing their lives to the violence, and some sort of accidental deaths also. So we see the high levels of inequality, as well as the loss of legitimacy in government, with high levels of corruption and crime. They've reached such proportions that these kinds of riots and other kinds of social unrest and social crises are inevitable.
Thanks for that, Ferran. Mersha, let's bring you in here. So both Sabu and Ferran have sketched, these tinder blocks, these embers that have been lit at different points. And Abashlali framed it so nicely in the statement that they made, that it was a ticking time bomb. But it's not just about poverty. It's not just about the delegitimization of the government. Give us a sense of what caused this last week.
I think the two previous, Spoo and Ferron, I think have made quite important points around the situation. I want to add a couple of additional things. The first is that we have a crisis in this country of over 50% people unemployed. It's unimaginable that this has not been declared a national crisis. Nowhere in the world do you have 50% of people unemployed.
Mersha, can I just ask you just to pause? Let me just go to a break. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation.
If you have just joined us, welcome back to Workers' World. This week's topic is economic sabotage and food riots in South Africa. But before we continue, let's get into this week's top stories. COSATU welcomes the restoration and extension of the UIF COVID-19 tours for vulnerable workers and those from restricted economic sectors. Moving abroad, the crisis is far from over for garment workers who are owed 11.85 billion USD after fashion brands inactions. And GMB's campaigns for equal pay, a model for retail sector. All this and more, do stay tuned for the full bulletin. Over to you, Helga.
Thank you, Michaela Miller. Let's get back to our conversation. Mersha?
So nowhere in...
You were saying that it's a state of emergency. Yeah.
Do we have this depth of unemployment? So not only do we have 50%, I'm not even including, because the statistics keep shifting. What about those that have given up looking for work, etc.? But in addition to the 50% that's unemployed, we also have the working poor. And SAFTU and other unions will tell you, I work with farm workers. There's no way in today's economy people can survive with households, and you earn a minimum wage of 350 Rand. 3,500. It's just impossible. So you have depth of unemployment, you have working poor, and then you have inequality. Cheek by jowl, you see massive, the bigger car, I don't even know how some of these cars cost on the streets today, cost what your house and my house cost. So you have this inequality that is there. You see this. What we also have had in the last period is a deepening recession. We have austerity. And at the beginning of the year, we've seen government removing many safety nets. So this is, I think, the picture that we must talk about. In addition, we see, if you look at a place like Durban, and I think we must look at why Durban, it's not just Zuma, because I think we've seen a big deindustrialization over the last period. Clothing factories, leather factories, shoe factories, car plants, all of these things have given to the destruction of a kind of deindustrialization. So what is left? We see more and more street traders, more and more informalization of jobs, of a whole different way in which society has been reorganized. And I think we're not sufficiently looking at all of those kinds of things. So I want to say, other than these economic factors, we must also say that the austerity in the country has given rise, and Spoo will tell you this, to a collapse of municipalities. They were already fragile. Now you see absolutely services have just shrunk. And whatever is left, what isn't looted, I mean, how much of it actually reaches citizens in our informal settlements, etc. So we have a fragile local municipality. You know, the picture is bleak.
Mirsha,
And on top of that,
if I may, I want to just insert this as well. The issue of, as we saw, and I think it would be, it is incumbent on us to raise this, the manner in which the elements of race reared its head in KZN. Is this an additional factor to all that you describe? The austerity, the absolute decimation of working class organizations to anticipate some of these things, and of course the fact that we've been through a year's worth of lockdown and a recession, coupled with the historical fault lines of race in this country. Is this a factor? Or is it just being used again to offset the fact that this is about poor people?
I think Spoo will probably deal with this better. I've lived in KZN, I've lived in Maritzburg. And so I know that this is a factor. We often underplay it and we sweep it under the carpet, but we've had tensions going back to the 1940s, where we've seen this racial, to call it racial tensions in KZN. And I think it's also how, if you look at where the settlements are, how the communities are organized, I think this is part of what we see. So
yeah,
I think it is an issue.
Sabu, maybe you can give us some reflection on that as well. The issue of race and class fault lines that were so exposed, particularly in KZN. Can you give us your sense of why, if this was exploited, and how organizations such as yours are going to respond into the future? Because it is something that our societies must begin to deal with.
I see.
Well, this is the factor. It is actually the combination of all what Misha has described. And you would recall that as Abahlali, we have been warning that the anger of the poor can go into many directions. And it comes xenophobia one day, it comes in the form of tribalism at some point. Now it comes in this racial tangent that we have witnessed in Phoenix, Chatsworth, and other areas. We've been living with this. Masha is right that we haven't really confronted it as a society. It will raise its ugly head, and then we pretend as if it doesn't exist. We sweep it underneath our carpet and we pretend as if things are normal. So I would say this is a combination of the whole lot of frustration that has been brought to us by the very time-ticking bomb that we've always been warning about, that under no circumstances, and I stress this again and again, that nowhere in the world where half of the population remains unemployed and it becomes business as usual. So it cannot be business as usual. So moving forward, I think we want to call on all progressive forces, that is the civil society organization, grassroots formations, labor movements, to confront this reality. And we need to really talk tough and ask difficult questions amongst ourselves. So the inequalities, obviously, that exist, I mean, the gap that continues to divide our communities would really fuel the current situation that we're facing. Unless we are honest to ourselves, we have an honest conversation that under no ways it will be possible for any society to live in peace and harmony when such inequalities, poverty, and unemployment continue to be the order of the day.
Thank you for that. Indeed, Sabu, there are some hard questions that us as a society would have to begin to ask. If we don't allow this, once the stability is back, some kind of stability, once 70% of people are vaccinated, and we say, okay, we can continue. But Ferran, this is a challenge. The way that Sabu frames it, it is indeed a challenge to trade union movements and social justice movements to begin to unearth those cultural, patriarchal nuances that exist even in our working class communities.
And I think I tend to agree with both you and Comrade Sabu that it's marginalized communities tend to be the first groups that are targeted when society, when the working class becomes desperate and when insecurity becomes the norm. Right? People are afraid. People are afraid. They don't know when they're going to eat. They don't know how they're going to feed their children. They don't know when their children are going to go back to school or if they're going to manage. So people are filled with fear, stress, and as a result, marginalized groups are, well, first the racial tensions that you've alluded to emerge, but then also we've seen, I'm in Johannesburg, and in Johannesburg around June 16th, we had a huge sort of a rise in xenophobic violence. We've also seen lots of hate crimes of LGBTQI communities and trans people in the recent period. So we have a lot of work to do, as Kwame Tsubu was saying, to unify the working class, organized labor, communities, and the youth to fight against this kind of discrimination, to both elevate consciousness and recognize that this is not the route to meet the needs of our people, but also to fight for an alternative, a political and economic alternative that will eventually meet the needs of all people.
When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about the uprisings and food riots of July 2021. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Workers' World Labour Show. We're talking uprisings to July 2021. Mersha, let's come to you. When Sabu opened up, he spoke about that it was a lot of young people. Are we in danger of losing what the sociologists call the youth dividend as a result of this extreme inequality in our society?
I think we're losing the youth to many different forces. If I come here from Cape Town, I live in, as you know, we work and live in close proximity to, and I come from a township, so gangs, our youth gangs, some areas in the Cape have completely become no-goes. Mannenberg, Bonteheuwel, etc. So I've had this fear, God, the the food riot, these riots can't come to Cape Town, because then we'll have the gangs come out and we'll have another dimension, etc. So we are losing youth to this layer. We are losing young people's hope is being lost. We are the ruling party, this ANC. I have to manage myself very well today, but I feel they have created a culture amongst young people of a looting culture. So you join the youth league, because once you join the youth league or the student ANC brigade or the whatever, this is your way to the top. And there's a culture. Oh, you don't have to work hard. You don't have to think hard. You don't have to be active in a branch. This is the route to get to become a counselor, etc., etc. And the more thuggish you are, the better it is for you, because then you can also be called on those who pay better money to maneuver and so on. So I think we've lost a great deal. Second issue for me is that our education system is in a complete crisis. I am too scared to think what's going to happen now after COVID. How many? It's only the middle class kids that are going to school every day. It's a disgrace that this is allowed to happen, that our government, this government, has allowed poor kids to become cannon fodder because they cannot go to school. They're running around in the townships. How do we, and who do they think is going to teach kids at home when people should be, when they're going to work, etc., etc. So there's a loss to so many areas. Then there's the de-skilling. Today, if you need a plumber, Spoo will tell you in all our communities, if you need a plumber, electrician, etc., it's not a local person with skills that can come any longer. I will have somebody from our neighboring communities who are the plumbers and the electricians, etc., because there's been an absolute destruction of an artisanal system where young people could be trained to be bricklayers, carpenters. I come from a society where there were skills. Today, those skills don't exist. The only skills is how to ride a taxi, how to whistle on the taxi, how to hustle with drugs, and. So we have, this government has created an elite society, 10% that they protect, and the rest, the 90%, cannon fodder. And after COVID, I can't even begin to imagine how we're going to get the dropouts from school, because that's another conversation we should all have. What's the extent of the dropouts of school during COVID, and what's going to happen to those kids? So I think the situation amongst young people, except for a few, there is hope, there is creativity, there's culture, but government's not offering. And I think us as people from the political movements, the labor movement, the youth, we need to begin to look at how do we rebuild a new imagination, a new culture where we can rebuild hope. And we can only rebuild hope through organization and through consciousness. Otherwise, the situation will be bleak for the next period. Thanks.
Sabu, Mersha frames the reality which is done in very stark terms. And if we think particularly about the youth dividend that has been decimated prior to COVID, during COVID, and the way that she frames it post-COVID, as a social movement, what the challenge that she's thrown out to you now as well, which I'm throwing out to you now, is in terms of organizing, what are the challenges and possible way forward to reignite that imagination to challenge the inequalities. I mean, you know, if you are like me, born in the 70s or 80s, we have the culture, the political and the social organizing culture. But as Mersha rightly frames it, that is being lost. That is being usurped by the culture of looting and the culture of gangs. How do we get those young people back? And as a social movement, what are the organizing strategies? I know that's an unfair question. I hope you can attempt to begin to frame some of that.
Yes, that's not an easy question because we have a pool, of young people in our communities, but so rare that you will see them in our organization. So I think the challenge that we have as organizations doing organizing work is really not having so much that could actually attract young people within our movement. I mean, Mersha talks about the collapse of our education system. Now, the question is, what do we do as organization also to fill up that vacuum, but also to replace and restore hope of young people within our organizations? So the little we can do and that we have begun to do as Abahlali, obviously, is to create safe space for young people, so as we do for women. But that space needs to have a lot of fun. It needs to have some attractive mechanism that will actually attract young people to our space, because our spaces are often boring, because they often talk about serious stuff, the future, and so on. And young people don't have that time. They are bored by our politics. So I think somehow we need to devise and design some mechanism that will actually attract young people. So like in Abahlali, we have an Abahlali Youth League as a space of young people where they are supported and given an opportunity to imagine the future that they want, but also participating in the discussion that the movement has, so that we can have also a young minds and the creativity that young people have, so that it can all filter into the programs of the movement. Because if we leave young people outside, we are really heading for another calamity. We got to have young people one way or the other.
I want to bring for... Say again, Mersha?
They also have choirs, all those kinds of things.
There is a tradition of, and it's almost organic strategies, whether it's the choir, whether it's the arts group. Ferran, there's also at the level of the trade union, there's always been a culture of bringing young shop stewards into the shop floor activities. But with the decimation of our sectors and of our industries, how is SAFTU dealing with this regeneration of leadership that is almost a natural thing, but these are unnatural times?
Yeah, and it's an absolute crisis even within the trade union movement, not being able to recruit young people, not even as shop stewards, but even as members. Young people are disillusioned, they're alienated from their work, from society, like Comrade Mersha was talking about, the high levels of drugs and alcohol abuse, and entries into gangsterism and so on, where they find a space or are able to dilute the sort of difficulties and hopelessness that society, South African society and society under capitalism in general, offers them. So in SAFTU, what we're doing at the moment is, because of the crisis in the public sector, we are focusing on trying to recruit young people, even at college and university level, into trade unions, making them, because trade unions, I mean, it used to be that trade unions had a very high profile and
Ferran, can I ask you just to pause? Let me just do a little bit of an ad and then we'll come back. You were talking about universities, trying to organize as universities. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation and the deep challenges that exist to social movements and trade unions in this post-unrest period. Welcome back. Before we continue our discussion, let's cross over to Michaela Miller at the Labour News Desk.
Thank you, Helga. We hope you're keeping safe. Welcome to the news. The Congress of South Africa Trade Unions welcomed the extension of the Unemployment Insurance Fund COVID-19 TERS for vulnerable workers and restricted economic sectors. This is what the Federation has been pursuing and championing at NEDLAC and represents a triumph for effective workers. To date, the UIF has injected over 60 billion rand, benefiting more than 5.5 million workers across the economy since March 2020. It has helped save millions of jobs. The COVID-19 TERS will cover workers over the age of 60 years or who have comorbidities who cannot work safely due to the pandemic. It will cover sectors of the economy partially or fully restricted from operating. These include liquor, tourism, hospitality, restaurants, travel, hotel, casinos, cinemas, bars, sports, entertainment, events, and the respective value chains. Applications started from Monday the 19th of July and payment will commence from Monday the 26th of July 2021. Payment will be made directly to workers' bank accounts where possible, and about 5.3 billion rand has been set aside by the UIF for this relief. All employers in these sectors are called upon to apply for this relief for their employees. Workers and unions in these sectors must ensure this happens, and those experiencing challenges should call the UIF's hotline on 0800 030 007. And in international news, since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, garment workers around the world have been left unpaid or underpaid, causing a wage gap between what they received and what they are owed. The report conducted by the International Clean Clothes Campaign from August 2020 estimates that for 7 countries, the wage losses that workers have suffered, and urges brands, retailers and e-tailers to commit to a wage assurance. Clean Clothes Campaign inserted that in the past 3 months, the global amount owed to workers has grown beyond $11.85 billion as many countries are entering new lockdowns. Clean Clothes Campaign is calling on apparel brands to negotiate an enforceable agreement to assure wages, establish a severance guarantee fund, and ensure respect for basic labor rights. Such a binding agreement to be negotiated and signed by trade unions with brands, individual employers or employer association will require a signatory brand to ensure workers in their supply chains receive their regular wages during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to ensuring payment of severance compensation for workers at the factories that are closed or undertake a mass dismissal and respect basic labor rights. And finally, in a webinar held by PRIC on equal pay or equal work, a shareholder highlighted the groundbreaking work of UNI Global Union's UK affiliate GMB in achieving equal pay for women in the retail sector. In the largest equal pay claim ever in the UK private sector, over 44,000 women who work at Asda supermarkets filed a joint complaint that their work was of equal value to that of their male counterparts working in the company's distribution centres. After the Supreme Court ruled in their favour and agreed that shop floor workers can compare themselves to distribution centre workers, unions including UNI affiliate US Door are supporting similar claims at major supermarket chains in Britain: Tesco, Sainsbury, Morrisons, Next and the Co-op. This case sets a precedent for retail companies not only in Britain but globally. Uplifting wages in the retail sector, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, would be a constructive step towards gender parity, and British unions are fighting tooth and nail to make it happen. That's a wrap from the news. If you have any story you'd like to share with us, you can send a WhatsApp message or voice note to 081 552 4551 or email us at labour@wwmp.org.za. That's all from my side. Over to you, Helga.
Thank you, Michaela. Ferran, before we had our news bulletin, you were busy explaining the strategies that SAFTU is employing to organize and to attract more young people by way of, I suppose, succession planning for leadership into the future?
Well, perhaps, but the main focus for us is to get the trade union movement, and our federation is only as strong as our worker democracy, our membership, the involvement, the membership of the leadership of the shop stewards and the shop and what's happening on the shop floor. And so we need to get young people into unions to get organized, so that they're able to refresh the layers of leadership, as you say. I mean, it's very important, and there's a recognition by the leadership of SAFTU that we need younger people, we need young layers to take over the reins, and also bring in new ideas, fresh perspectives. We can't be having the same debates for the last 20 years. We have people with a new focus. Young people are very focused on issues of climate change, of issues of gender-based violence. We have young women, young feminists who are coming in to our movements, who need to be encouraged and supported, and we need to make space for them. I think that's a very important aspect. As much as we need to attract young people, we also need to make space for their voices. So I'm very happy that the other comrades have agreed that young people should be leading.
Ferran, thank you for that. Mersha, let's change tack a little bit now. We've spoken about the moment, which was last week, July 2021. We've spoken about all the different layers that have given rise to this. And as Sabu says, it will not be the last time if we don't deal with what's happening in our society. Let's talk a little bit about the policy positions of the ANC government that have led to this. Let's just give, particularly around economics, particularly around, and I think it was Vish Satka who spoke about in an article this week, spoke about the need for renewal. As you said, the renewal of imagination. Taxation of the wealthy, a basic income grant. These are the basic pillars that might be able to get us off this trajectory. Mersha?
So thanks. I do think I agree with the basic income grant, and I think it's very important. But I also want to put in this debate the question of land. Because when we talk only about the basic income grant, it means we can take from fiscus, we can just redistribute, and we can find systems of taxation. I think that's critical. But if we do not tackle structural issues, structural obstacles like land, then we will never change and have a redistribution of wealth, a redistribution of how people feed themselves, how we rebuild markets, etc. What we've got is a complete lack of imagination of the ANC. Every time, everywhere you build a mall, and all you do about building a mall means that my pennies that I get from the social grants go straight back to the mall, straight back to capital. It's a kind of direct conduit through the mall. And so there's very little reorganization of our local communities. How do we rethink different food systems, you know, where we have fresh food markets, where people can go and buy food, where people who grow food, bring the food, sell it, reorganize our way in which or decentralize the economy, as it were, restructure it, break down the control of capital or the concentration of capital in the way that it is at the moment. So I'm just putting that in as one, I think, important example of how we must begin to rethink the demands that we must make, etc. And demands is basic income grant, I support, but I think it shouldn't be the only one. It must go hand in hand with other structural demands, like an increase of the minimum wage, like skilling of youth and artisanal training programs, so that resources, investment also go into people. We don't live by food alone, especially with a little money that come from the basic income grant. We need a system where there can be training. You see the university health, the doctor's program. 2 years after a doctor is trained, they go and work in a hospital. We need to have a similar system. If you leave high school, you're going to get training for 2 years in a like it was before. You're going to go and learn to be a motor mechanic or this or that, so that we have a massive reskilling program, because when you have skills, you don't always need a boss. You can work and do and build local industries differently. So for me, these are some of the ways I think that all of us must begin to rethink. You know, we have a culture in this country of making demands. We make demands and statements, but we don't challenge capital. We don't challenge the structural impediments to the changes of this society. And we don't challenge the way in which the wealth is monopolized. The supermarket system, for me, is one of the ways in which has been the destruction of many household, little spazas, little shops where families were employed, etc., etc. And that creates greater monopoly of 6, 7 supermarkets, retail stores control society. So I'm going to stop there because I see Farron's hand up, but I think this must be part of our thinking as well. Thanks.
Farron, okay, before we get to you, thank you for that, Mersha. I just want to alert both of you, when we come back, I'd like to continue the discussion about land, and also Mersha's thing about we make demands, but we're not challenging the structural impediments in our society. When we come back, we will continue our conversation about the unrest and what needs to be done in our society. Welcome to the final segment of the Workers' World Labour Show. Farron, you had your hand up. I'd like for you to respond.
Yes, I just want to reiterate and sort of support what Comrade Mersha was saying around the structural need, the need for structural change. We need systems change and not superficial changes. Even the measly social relief grant that was given out during COVID, which has now ended, that was not enough. 350 rand is not enough for a family to survive on, or to meet the needs of a household. So we are definitely calling for an increase in for the extension of the grant, for an increase of the grant, for an expansion of the grant, so that it includes caregivers. As Comrade Mersha was saying, the grant is very important, this basic income grant, and we're seeing more and more people, more and more movements supporting the idea of the grant. But there are other structural problems. If the ANC government was serious about rebuilding South Africa, they'd be serious about a legitimate public works program. There is so much work to be done. We need, and they're all linked. So we need housing, we need social workers, we need public lighting, we need infrastructure in our schools, we need public transport, access to public transport. There's so many, and sustainable public transport. So we have to rejig our economy also to deal with the climate crisis. So there's so much work to be done, but instead of making sure that people are able to do that work, government is employing an austerity budget, cutting wages, cutting social spending, and that is not the kind of policy that is going to create this kind of structural change that will stop riots and unrest like we've seen.
Sabu, Abashlali, one of the biggest and most influential social movements, Mersha raises the issue about land redistribution, but also challenging structural edifice of our society. Where to now for your social movement, or for the movement that you belong to?
Yes, for Abahlali and for many or millions of people of South Africa, the land remains the key issue at play that we should not be shy to say that unless the issue of land is addressed correctly in terms of the demand of the people of South Africa, we are not going to go anywhere with all the economic changes that we are proposing. So the first thing is that the government should release land. So there needs to be a rapid land release not only for housing, but for also urban farming, for community farming, because the money that we have isn't enough. I fully support the basic grant, but also the COVID-19 relief grant that was swept away. We still need that. And we think that our country is rich enough to be able to feed, house, clothe everybody. This can only be done when the land, which really holds our economy, if there is a fair distribution of land. So moving forward, Abahlali make the demands that unless the land is released to all the people of South Africa who actually needs land, not only to few elites or few commercial farmers, that still holds the massive part of our land. So that would be the first thing. But we also call on that the government to actually make sure that there's food provision for everyone. It cannot be correct that there are families that go to bed hungry without food. That cannot be correct, and it is not sustainable. So if the land is then released, it means every family, at least those who are interested, could have a community gardens or run cooperatives where people can actually access food. So the food security is important at this time to actually add on the financial constraints that we face as a country.
We're heading towards the final segment, the last 3 minutes of our show, and I'd like to ask each of you one final question, noting the time. And Sabu, we'll stay with you. In the last period, your organization have held a cry of the excluded assembly. Very briefly tell our viewers what that was about and what the next period holds for your social movement in terms of organizing in this moment.
Well, as part of the cry of the excluded, of course, there are a number of issues that number of comrades within the cry of excluded have been putting forward. And one has been that the government needs to end its austerity policies that really continue to strip and to steal from the poor and giving the rich, people who are already, rich. So we are calling upon government and all progressive forces to help us, as the cry of the excluded, a number of progressive forces to make sure that at least the basic income grant is released so that we do not have the kind of frustration that has exploded today, and it will continue to explode in different forms.
Thank you. Ferran, in this moment, SAFTU's strategies, will you grab the moment and make those structural demands as we spoke about earlier?
Absolutely. We were very pleased that at the last Cry of the Excluded assembly, there were so many activists and working class communities, over 200 activists and working class communities, youth attended that meeting, including SAFTU and SAFTU affiliates were also there. As well as AMCU, the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, they were also there. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities for us to take this moment, but we need to recognize that our meeting on Saturday, where we were planning for what our next steps is and what the working class response will be, was only the beginning, and that we were outlining the process that we need to take so that we could have a even bigger assembly of thousands of people. At the moment, we're doing it virtually, but we've been able to, through various donations and so on, get data to make sure that everybody's able to attend. But we need to include, community civics, youth movements, more trade unions, more social movements across the country. So we're building and mobilizing, and we invite more and more working class movements to participate in the Cry of the Excluded, the different assemblies that are happening. We're also having the Working Class Summit, which is happening in September, which includes all these different groups. Because we need to have a unified campaign, including eventually when it's safe, rolling mass action. We cannot be forced into isolation when so many of us are starving. So there has to be a national day of action. Yeah.
Mersha, is this the moment where things might change? I'm talking about a structural challenge to the structure. Is this the moment, or do we need a few more, heaven forbid, uprisings like this?
It's difficult to say. I've been around this block for too long. And I've been in many moments like this. And on Saturday, one of my comrades made the point that there've been many moments. And so the most important thing for me, and I think I want to stress this, because on Saturday, unfortunately, it wasn't stressed enough. Unless we have cry of the excluded spaces and forums in every community, in every town, self-organized, unless that happens, and unless people come together and say, we have had enough, and begin to build a different logic, a different momentum as we had in the past, we are not going to, this moment might just be a little blip that shakes the government. And already I think we need to use the next 2 weeks to push for a victory. And the victory must be the basic income grant. And that is going to come from mass organizations. It's not, unfortunately, sometimes we have, on Saturday, we had all kinds of voices that perhaps sometimes crowded out the voices of popular movements. So we have to have popular movements take the front, take the lead. So if the Working Class Summit has to be part of Abashlali, part of the cry of the excluded, but they must lead. The Rural Women's Assembly, all these movements must unite. Unless we build unity, and unless we cross the racial tensions and divides of Gauteng, so where is Eldorado Park, Ferron? Where are they? We must have less C-point voices and more Aldo voices in these meetings. And on Saturday, sadly, there were too many C-point voices speaking on behalf of the masses. I like to call a spade a spade. And we need to begin to say, let the people's voices be heard. Let them speak, and because only they are going to liberate themselves. I cannot liberate, but it is the working class, the rural poor, the unemployed, the masses that are going to liberate themselves. That for me is what we've got to learn, and it's a hard lesson. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Indeed, the next 2 weeks might be crucial for social movements and trade unions if we are to harness the anger that has exploded on our streets, particularly in Gauteng and KZN, and harness them for the change that society needs. I'd like to say thank you to our guests, Ferron Pedro from SAFTU, Mersha Andrews from TCOE, and Sibu Sekoda from Abashlali. Thank you to all of you for your time and all the best in your organizations going forward.
Thank you.
From me, thanks. From me, Helgi Jansen-Daubia, and our crew here at our home studio, we wish you well till next time.